tonight, in this deep dive, I want you to picture a scenario. Um, you're an adult, right? You handle complex problems at work, you manage a household, you navigate all these intricate social dynamics every single day with, total competence.
Right, you're fully functioning.
Exactly. But then the holidays roll around, or maybe just a random Sunday dinner, and you walk through the front door of your childhood home.
Oh, yeah. I know where this is going.
And before you've even taken off your coat, before that first real greeting is even finished, something invisible just shifts in the atmosphere. It's like the air pressure literally changes.
It absolutely does.
And suddenly, without even deciding to, you find yourself completely reverting. Like you might be 35 or 40 or 50 years old, but internally, you are instantly 10 years old again.
Yep. You catch yourself lowering your voice or preemptively hiding parts of your life.
Right. Softening your opinions, tiptoeing around certain topics. And the strangest part is nobody actually told you to do this. You're doing it because the very architecture of that house, like the invisible hum of the family machine, just demands it.
It's a universally recognized phenomenon, honestly. And yet, it's one we rarely pause to actually dissect. We just sort of shrug and accept it as, well, that's just the way my family is.
Yeah, we just normalize it.
We do. But that invisible hum you're describing, that feeling of the air demanding a very specific version of you, that isn't magic. And it's definitely not just nostalgia. It is a highly structured, deeply ingrained psychological system.
Which is fascinating.
It is. Basically, every family operates on a hidden frequency. There's this set of unspoken rules, these scripts that were written before we were even born, and they completely dictate how we love, how we argue, how we process failure, and ultimately how we belong.
And that is exactly what we are decoding today. Because whether you find yourself in constant, just exhausting friction with your parents, or maybe you're struggling to connect with your own teenager, or you just feel inexplicably isolated at family gatherings, there is a hidden architecture to those interactions.
There really is a blueprint underneath it all.
Right. So we're going to look at a ton of fascinating source material today. We're getting into the psychology behind these unspoken family rules. We're going to explore the phenomenon of adult-child estrangement, the literal loss of shared language in immigrant families, and even the neuroscience of silence.
It's a huge stack of research, but it's also connected.
Hmm?
And as we unpack this, it's super crucial to establish our baseline right up front. The goal today is not to judge.
Exactly. No shame here.
Right. It's not to assign blame to your parents or to your kids or to yourself. The goal is simply to help you feel seen. We want to show you that your behaviors, and honestly, the often frustrating behaviors of the people in your life, they actually make complete logical human sense once you lift the hood and understand the engine driving them.
I love that. So let's start right there, under the hood, with that visceral reaction of walking into the childhood home. I really want to put a name to that feeling.
Let's do it.
So looking at the clinical world, specifically the work of Dr. Janice Webb, whose focus is on childhood emotional neglect, or CEN, she has a term for this, she calls them unspoken family rules.
We should clarify, these aren't the rules on the fridge, right?
Yeah.
Like curfew or doing the dishes.
Right, right. These are the powerful, completely unsaid messages that just sort of seep into the base of our brains during those formative years.
And the really insidious nature of an unspoken rule is precisely that it is unspoken. Because it's never articulated out loud, it can never be debated or challenged by the child.
It's just the water the fish is swimming in.
Exactly. And Dr. Webb notes that these rules, they don't stay confined to your childhood home. They embed themselves into your neural pathways. They become this unconscious blueprint for how you navigate the entire adult world.
Shaping, like, everything.
Right, shaping your deep-seated beliefs about what you deserve, how much space you're allowed to take up, and how you are supposed to handle emotional pain.
The source material we have from Dr. Wood's community is just wild because people were asked to actually articulate these rules, to drag them out of the unconscious and write them down on paper, and hearing them out loud is a revelation.
It really makes the abstract concrete.
Totally. So I want to look at a few specific ones. There was a woman named Petra who shared the core rule of her household, and the rule was, get this, your behavior is making your father ill.
Wow. That is heavy.
Right. Now, she noted her father had severe heart disease before she was even conceived, but the unspoken atmosphere of the house dictated that a child's normal, noisy, independent behavior was somehow directly responsible for his physical survival.
Which is just an impossible burden. Consider the psychological weight of that on a developing brain. For a child, the drive for autonomy, right? The drive to play, to make mistakes, to be loud, it's biologically imperative.
It's just what kids do.
Exactly. But Petra's rule equates that natural independence with inflicting literal existential harm on her parent. She's learning that taking up space is basically lethal.
Oh, man.
Yeah. A child in that environment will quickly learn to amputate their own needs, to shrink themselves entirely, just to keep the peace.
And that shrinking, that's a perfect segue into another incredibly common rule we saw in the sources, shared by a user named Leah. Her family's rule was always act like everything is okay, even when it's not.
The classic performance rule.
Yes. She described her family living by the mantra, in this home, we are all fine. Which was wild because internally, everyone was totally miserable. There was addiction, there was depression, but the surface just had to remain perfectly glassy. They genuinely thought that performance was what a family was supposed to be.
Dr. Webb actually categorizes rules, likely as in Petra's, into a specific bucket. She calls them above-the-line messages.
Above the line. Meaning what exactly?
These are the classic defining markers of childhood emotional neglect. They're rules that demand the absolute suppression of the self for the sake of the family's image or perceived stability. So the messages are things like wanting something is selfish, or emotions are a sign of weakness, or, don't bring any complex problems into this house.
It just sounds so exhausting. I mean, if you grow up marinating in those above-the-line rules, what does that actually look like when you're 35 and trying to navigate a marriage or a career?
It creates a pervasive, haunting feeling of being personally invalid. If you're raised to believe that having a need makes you a burden, or that expressing sadness makes you weak, you naturally grow into an adult who feels fundamentally flawed simply for being a human being.
Because humans have needs.
Right. So you might find yourself in a relationship where you literally never ask for what you want, or you're in a job where you take on everyone else's work because your default setting is just self-sacrifice. You learn to survive by being invisible, and then later in life you wonder why you feel so profoundly disconnected from the people around you.
Wow. Yeah, that hits hard. But there's a second category, right? If above the line is about suppressing the self, what's the alternative dysfunction?
The second category consists of below-the-line messages. So the first group makes you suppress your reality. The second group demands that you twist it.
Twist it how?
These are rules built around distortion and intense, sometimes really toxic loyalty. Things like, don't trust anyone outside this family, or we never talk about your uncle's drinking, or the really damaging one, if we don't acknowledge the abuse, it didn't happen.
Oh, wow. So it's an entire ecosystem built on gaslighting.
It really is.
Yeah.
These rules teach a child to navigate the world through evasion rather than confrontation. It fosters a deep paranoia about the outside world. So adults raised with below-the-line rules often find themselves in these agonizing positions later on where they're prioritizing blind family loyalty, even when the family dynamic is actively destroying their own mental health or their own nuclear family.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second here. Because as we're dissecting all of this, I can easily imagine someone listening and thinking, hold on, aren't some rules necessary?
Of course.
Like, a family is a complex organization, right? If we don't have some structured hierarchy, if we just let everyone express every raw emotion loudly all the time, the house just descends into chaos. Children need boundaries, don't they?
That is the essential tension of parenting, absolutely.
What?
And it actually brings us to a really robust piece of behavioral science in our sources. It isn't about the mere existence of rules. As you said, every society and family needs structure. The pathology actually lies in how those rules are enforced and the overall communication climate that surrounds them.
Okay, so how do we measure that climate?
Well, there's a fascinating study from Malaysia that looked at adolescence through the lens of the family communication patterns theory, or FCPT. And this framework is incredibly useful because it maps out the schemas that families use to co-create their reality.
I like that. So it's measuring the weather of the household, not just the furniture.
That is a perfect way to look at it. So the researchers identified two primary dimensions of this weather. The first one is called conformity orientation.
Okay, conformity orientation.
Right. In a family with high conformity orientation, the parental authority is absolute and unquestionable. The climate stresses homogeneity. Basically, everyone must share the exact same attitudes, values, and beliefs. The unspoken rule is that harmony is achieved only through sameness.
Which mirrors those below-the-line rules we just talked about. The mandate is basically, don't rock the boat, think what we think, feel what we feel, and we'll be fine.
Exactly. Children are expected to adopt their parents' exact worldview. And any deviation from that is treated as a major threat to the family structure. And a Malaysian study found something deeply concerning, though probably totally predictable to anyone who grew up like this.
What did they find?
High conformity orientation is a significant predictor of depression symptoms in adolescence.
Really?
Yeah, because when a developing teenager's autonomy and individual identity are actively suppressed in favor of this rigid family homogeneity, it fundamentally fractures their sense of self. It breeds this quiet internal despair.
But the opposite of conformity isn't just, letting teenagers run wild with zero oversight, right? What is the alternative orientation the study outlines?
Right. The alternative isn't chaos. The alternative is called conversation orientation. This measures the degree to which a family creates a climate where all members, regardless of their age, are encouraged to participate freely in interactions about a really wide array of
But it's
topics.
just more open.
Very open. A family with high conversation orientation shares ideas, they debate current events, they discuss their days, and most importantly, they allow for disagreement.
Which implies a massive level of emotional regulation on the parents' part, right? Like they have to be secure enough to hear a 14-year-old say, I think you're wrong, without interpreting that as a fatal attack on their authority.
That is the crux of it right there.
Yeah.
And the data shows that high conversation orientation actually acts as a powerful buffer against emotional problems. It actively protects adolescents against depression.
Because they feel heard.
Exactly. Because the underlying unspoken message in a high conversation home is, your thoughts matter, your feelings are valid, you are a separate human being from me, and you are totally safe to express that separation here.
When you lay it out like that, it makes so much sense. But it also highlights a pretty heartbreaking reality, I think. When a family is just steeped in that high conformity, when the air is thick with, we don't talk about that and just smile and eat your dinner, it rarely actually comes from a place of intentional malice.
Oh, absolutely not.
Right. Parents aren't usually sitting in a villain's lair plotting to suppress their kids. They enforce these rigid, silent rules because they are terrified. They're operating on their own outdated scripts, trying to manage their own unresolved pain. Which sort of leads us to the mechanism of inheritance. How exactly does this emotional stagnation get passed down from one generation to the next?
Generational inheritance is such a heavy, complex process. We so often think of inheritance in terms of genetics or, property.
Yeah.
But honestly, the most potent thing we inherit is our emotional posture, like how to stand in the face of grief or how to react to fear.
Yeah. And to truly understand what this transmission looked like from the inside, there's a fascinating piece of literary analysis in our stack of sources. It explores Shashi Deshpande's story called My Beloved Charioteer.
And a brilliant example.
It really is. The researchers use this specific narrative because it maps the architecture of emotional paralysis perfectly. So we have Arti, who is a widowed mother. She is completely paralyzed by the grief of losing her husband and her father. She can't sleep. She lives in a house that just feels like a mausoleum, completely trapped in the memories of her past.
And the focus of the research here is on the collateral damage of that internal paralysis. The question is, how does Archie's unhealed grief manifest in her relationship with her young daughter, Pretty?
Well, it manifests as a giant wall. Artie basically has no emotional bandwidth left for her child. Pretty will approach her, seeking just basic maternal connection, and Artie just snaps at her. She pushes her away, saying things like, go to sleep, Pretty, don't bother me.
She's just empty.
Right. The mother is so consumed by the ghost of what she has lost that she is entirely absent from the living child standing right in front of her. So the unspoken rule Pretty is internalizing every single day is, my mother's grief is infinitely larger and more important than my need for her.
And this dynamic is a textbook illustration of how generational emotional stagnation replicates itself. The mother has suffered a profound, entirely legitimate trauma. But her inability to process that trauma, her choice to basically freeze instead of feeling, it begins to freeze the child.
It's contagious, almost.
It is. Emotional neglect is rarely an active choice to harm. It is most often the byproduct of a parent who is drowning and simply cannot reach out a hand. Preeti is learning that emotions are dangerous, that connection is unavailable, and that she has to manage her own existence silently.
But the brilliance of the story, and I think the reason the researchers highlighted, is the presence of a third character in the house, the grandmother, Aji.
Aji is the key.
She is. Aji is also a widow. She has also suffered the profound loss of her husband and her son. But unlike Archie, Aji has actually done the agonizing work of processing her grief. She isn't frozen. She has a warm, active, loving relationship with her granddaughter. And Aji realizes that she cannot just stand by and watch this generational freeze take hold of Pretty. So she intervenes.
And the nature of her intervention is what really matters here. How does one actually break a cycle of avoidance?
Well, you have to force the confrontation with reality, right? Aji basically sits her daughter down and refuses to let her hide anymore. She confronts the unspoken rules of the house. She models the act of letting go by forcing Artie to look at the painful truths of her past, the realities of her marriage that she had sort of romanticized or buried.
She breaks the silence.
Exactly. By acting as the emotional anchor, Aji absorbs the shockwave of Artie's grief, which breaks the cycle of stagnation. And this intervention frees the granddaughter, Preeti. She is finally allowed to represent a fresh start, a generation that does not have to be the silent caretaker of her mother's unhealed wounds.
The psychological role of the elder here is profound. The grandmother recognizes the loop. She sees the FCPT conformity orientation we talked about earlier that demand that everyone just suffer silently, and she shatters it with conversation orientation.
She changes the weather.
Exactly. She proves that just because a pattern is deeply generational, it is not an inescapable destiny. A single person with enough emotional resilience can stop the tape and rewrite the script for the whole family.
That's a really hopeful takeaway. But let's add a massive layer of complexity to this, because it's one thing to navigate internal family grief in a vacuum, right? Like inside a stable home. But what happens when that fragile, emotionally stagnant family dynamic is suddenly dropped into a completely foreign external environment?
That changes the game entirely.
It does. To understand this, we're looking at a brilliant project out of New Zealand called Thriving at Crossroads, which was conducted in partnership with Asian Family Services. And this research shifts us from the internal living room to the massive external systemic pressures that crush family communication.
We are moving into the lived experiences of ethnic minority youth and immigrant families, specifically those navigating multiple intersecting cultural identities under just immense pressure.
And the researchers use a conceptual framework here called the integrated tree model, which I think is just one of the most vivid ways to visualize human development. I really want you to imagine your family, your life, as a tree.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The roots of this tree are your cultural beliefs, your ancestral values, your fundamental philosophies about the world. The trunk is your core identity, your age, your gender, your innate personality.
Right.
The branches and the leaves represent your skills, your life experiences, your education, and your language. And finally, the flowers and the fruit. That represents your emotional well-being, your health, and your self-actualization.
It's a beautifully holistic model. If the roots are nourished and the environment is stable, the food is healthy.
Exactly. Now, consider the act of immigration. You are taking this fully formed tree, you're ripping it out of the soil it has known for generations, and you are planting it in an entirely new earth. The roots are exposed, the branches are shaken. What does the science actually tell us about the immediate aftermath of that uprooting?
Well, the clinical term for this shock is acculturative stress. And the research indicates that the first 2 to 5 years after migration are an extraordinarily vulnerable period. The family tree is desperately trying to form new feeding roots in unfamiliar soil.
They're just trying to survive.
Right. They're dealing with immediate structural risks, maybe a drastic drop in income, or the loss of professional credentials, the struggle to find safe housing. But beyond the logistics, they're facing a tectonic shift in what Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory calls the macro system.
Okay, let's translate that for the listener. If the tree is the family, the macro system is the climate, right? The sunlight, the temperature, the gravity.
That is a perfect analogy. The macro system encompasses the societal norms, the legal structures, the political climate, and the overall cultural expectations of the new country. So if a tree accustomed to a humid, tropical climate is abruptly planted in a freezing, arid environment, the roots might desperately hold on, but the leaves are going to start to wither.
It's a total shock to the system.
For an immigrant family, their foundational unspoken rules, their roots, might suddenly clash violently with the rules of the society just outside their front door.
And the research from Thriving at Crossroads points out that for some young people, this clash creates a double minority experience. Take, for example, an Asian teenager who also identifies as rainbow or LGBTQ plus
Well, the pressures there are staggering.
Just look at the immense pressure on their trunk and branches. On one hand, they're trying to honor the cultural expectations and collectivist values of their family's heritage. Simultaneously, they're trying to assimilate into the societal expectations of the new Western country. And on top of all that, they are navigating the specific marginalization of their gender or sexual identity within both of those spheres.
They are living on multiple fault lines simultaneously. And the hypervigilance required to exist in that space is just exhausting. This is why the researchers emphasize that for these youth, finding validation through sameness, finding safe intersectional communities where they do not have to explain or justify any part of their identity, it's not just a nice bonus. It is an absolute critical requirement for their mental health.
Because if they look to their family tree for support, the parents might be completely tapped out, right? The parents are exhausted from the sheer grinding effort of economic and cultural survival. They barely have the bandwidth to process their own acculturative stress, let alone guide a teenager through a complex intersectional identity crisis.
Exactly. That conversation orientation we talked about earlier, it completely collapses because everyone is just in survival mode.
And when human beings are in prolonged survival mode, when the emotional bandwidth is depleted and the stress is compounding daily, they inevitably look for ways to cope. As we review the data from Asian Family Services, it's really crucial to objectively examine how these immense pressures can lead to maladaptive coping mechanisms.
It's a natural, if destructive, human response.
One stark example the data highlights is the disproportionately high risk of gambling harm among certain Asian migrant communities in New Zealand. Now, at first glance, that feels like a sudden leap. We're talking about cultural uprooting and teenage identity, and suddenly we're talking about gambling. What is the mechanism connecting those dots?
The connection becomes crystal clear when we return to that integrated tree model. Start with the roots. In many Asian cultures, there are deep-seated cognitive frameworks and myths built around luck, fate, numerology, and the illusion of controlling outcomes.
Okay.
Now look at the trunk and branches. The family is experiencing severe acculturative stress, downward social mobility, and financial panic. They are desperate for a solution to their sudden vulnerability.
And then you add the macro system.
Exactly. The new country has vastly different regulations. The macro system makes gambling venues like casinos or electronic gaming machines incredibly accessible, often strategically placing them in lower income or migrant-heavy neighborhoods. So you have a perfect, devastating storm. The profound stress of the uprooting meets the cultural predisposition toward luck, which meets the physical, unrestricted access to the gambling venue.
The venue essentially becomes an escape hatch, a place where, for an hour or two, the overwhelming pressure of being an immigrant, of maybe failing to provide, of losing your status back home, it all just disappears into the hypnotic rhythm of a machine.
Precisely. And it is imperative to view this not as a moral failing, but as a structural and psychological collision. The individual is trying to solve a very real, agonizing problem: financial terror and cultural isolation, using a mechanism that the new environment has made dangerously available.
Which completely removes the stigma when you frame it that way.
It does. Understanding the why paves the way for effective healing. Things like family-inclusive peer support groups that actually honor the collectivist culture while gently dismantling those cognitive distortions around luck and fate.
This analysis is so vital because it reveals how families, despite their absolute best, most desperate intentions to survive and protect each other, can just be torn apart by massive, invisible barriers.
It's heartbreaking, but it's common.
But as we sift through this research, we hit a phenomenon that is so literal, so heartbreakingly concrete, it almost defies belief. I mean, we've talked about unspoken rules and we've talked about cultural stress, but what happens to the family dynamic when you and your parents literally, physically no longer possess the vocabulary to speak to each other?
You're referring to shared language erosion. This is a quiet, profound tragedy playing out in millions of immigrant households globally right now, and the psychological ramifications are truly staggering.
The mechanics of this erosion, as detailed in the sociolinguistic research, they map out a distinct, almost inevitable trajectory. When a family immigrates, you have two generations reacting to the new linguistic environment in completely opposite ways.
Right.
The children, the second generation, are fully immersed in the new macro system. They go to school, they consume media, they socialize, so they acquire the new language, like English, at an exponential rate. But concurrently, because they're spending so much time in English, they rapidly lose proficiency in their heritage language.
It's a use it or lose it scenario for the kids.
Mm-hmm.
And then we look at the first-generation parents. Their trajectory is entirely different because they often work within their ethnic enclaves, or honestly, their brain plasticity is simply different in adulthood. They make only modest, gradual gains in English.
Keeping their first language.
Exactly. Meanwhile, they perfectly maintain their fluency in their heritage language.
So if you visualize this on a graph, you have two lines moving in opposite directions. The child's English proficiency spikes up while their heritage language drops. The parent's heritage language remains a flat, high line, while their English barely creeps upward. And right there in the middle, where those lines intersect and pass each other, the shared language just evaporates. The bridge collapses.
And the impact of that collapse goes far, far beyond the logistical annoyance of needing a translation app at the dinner table. It fundamentally destroys a psychological state known as intersubjectivity.
Intersubjectivity. Okay, let's break that down for the listener. What is actually happening in the brain when we lose that?
Intersubjectivity is the complex, shared reality that two people co-construct through nuanced interaction. It's the ability to truly comprehend what the other person means, to grasp their internal state, not just process their literal words.
Right.
In a family, talk is the fundamental mechanism of connection. It's how you share humor, how you express subtle disappointments, how you validate fears. If you lose the shared language, you lose the texture of the entire relationship.
It makes me think of trying to describe a profoundly complex emotional dream to a friend, but you are only allowed to use the 500 most common words in the English language. You can give them the basic plot, like, I was running, I was scared, but you completely lose the soul of the experience. The nuance is just gone. You are communicating, but you aren't connecting.
That is exactly what it feels like.
Oh,
And this erosion severely attacks a very specific, high-stakes area of family life, which researchers call the hierarchical domain of parenting.
okay. How does that play out in the actual living room?
Well, consider the developmental imperative of adolescence. It is completely normal and healthy for a teenager to push for autonomy. They want to test boundaries, they want to choose their peers, negotiate curfews.
Oh, yeah. Every teenager does this.
Right. In a healthy, linguistically fluent dynamic, the parent and the teen engage in complex negotiation. The parent listens to the child's reasoning, validates their desire for independence, but firmly maintains their authority, finding a compromise. This is the hallmark of authoritative parenting.
But that takes words.
Lots of them. It requires high-level vocabulary, emotional nuance, and the ability to debate abstract concepts like trust and responsibility.
So a parent might say, I hear that you want to go to this party, and I respect that you're getting older, but my concern is the lack of supervision. Let's negotiate a scenario where you can socialize, but I feel you are safe. That is a highly sophisticated linguistic dance.
It really is. Now, imagine that exact same scenario under the weight of shared language erosion. The teenager is arguing their case in rapid, fluent, nuanced English. The parent can only respond in broken English, or they argue back in the heritage language, which the teen only partially understands.
The negotiation instantly collapses.
It fully collapses. The parent is suddenly stripped of their ability to reason with their child. They feel incompetent, humiliated, and deeply threatened. They can quite literally see their child slipping away into a world they cannot articulate.
So how does a parent react when they feel that threatened? I mean, what's the fallback?
They fall back on primal survival mechanisms. Driven by fear, parents experiencing this erosion often abandon authoritative parenting entirely. They default to the extremes. Many become overly punitive and authoritarian.
Because they can't explain why?
Exactly. Because they cannot negotiate with words, they rule by strict, non-negotiable decree. Because I said so becomes the only tool left in the toolbox. Alternatively, they swing the other way and become entirely permissive, simply giving up and withdrawing, because the cognitive load of trying to fight across a language barrier is just too exhausting.
I really want to pause here and speak directly to you, the person listening right now. Think about your own childhood for a moment. If you grew up in a household where you had to be the translator for your parents, reading the mail, talking to the bank teller, explaining the world to them, or if you felt like your parents were impossibly, strictly authoritarian dictators who never bothered to listen to your side of the story.
It's so common.
It is. But it might not be that they didn't care about your feelings. It might not be that they wanted to be tyrants. It might be that the structural, literal loss of language triggered a panic response in your relationship. They were holding on to you as tightly and rigidly as they could, simply because the bridge of language between you had fallen away, and they were terrified of losing you to the current.
That is such a profound and necessary reframe. It shifts the internal narrative from my parents were unreasonable and controlling to our relationship was starved of the language required to negotiate peace.
But the tragic reality is that when that gap, whether it's caused by language erosion or the acculturative stress of immigration or the toxic unspoken rules of childhood emotional neglect we started with, when that gap becomes too vast, the tension becomes unbearable. The bridge doesn't just sway, it snaps.
It breaks completely.
And that brings us to the ultimate breakdown of the family architecture, the breaking point, estrangement.
Estrangement is historically a topic enveloped in profound silence and cultural shame. But the data clearly shows it is becoming a defining feature of modern family dynamics. We are looking at a massive relational shift right now.
We have recent, compelling findings from the Australian Psychological Society and researchers at Ohio State University. They are tracking a generational tidal wave. Millennials and Gen Z are increasingly, and often permanently, making the active choice to halt all communication with their parents.
This represents a massive shift in the macro system of values. In previous generations, family loyalty was often the supreme, unquestionable virtue.
You just put up with it.
Right, you stayed connected to your parents, you showed up for the holidays, no matter how toxic, abusive, or draining the dynamic was. Duty trumped all. But today, the paradigm is completely inverted. An individual's emotional health, their psychological safety, and their boundaries are taking precedence over traditional loyalty.
Which makes sense given the language we have now.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah.
Younger generations now possess a vast mainstream vocabulary for mental health, trauma, and narcissistic dynamics. They are actively evaluating their relationships and asking, does this dynamic make me feel safe? Am I valued as an individual? And if the answer is consistently no, they are choosing the pain of silence over the pain of the struggle.
But here is the truly staggering finding from the Ohio State University research. The researchers didn't just look at the estranged children. They interviewed mothers who were estranged from their adult children, and then they interviewed those specific adult children.
The pairing is what makes the study so powerful.
And the results showed an absolute fundamental disconnect. They were living in two entirely different realities. They rarely agreed on what actually caused the rupture.
The perception gap is enormous, and it's highly gendered and specific in the research regarding mothers. When asked why the estrangement happened, mothers frequently point outward. They blame external factors. Like they point to an ex-husband, who they claim brainwashed the child against them. They point to the child's new spouse, claiming they're controlling or manipulative. Or they point to external stressors like financial ruin or mental illness. They look everywhere outside the core mother-child relationship for the cause of the fracture.
But when the researchers asked the adult children, they tell a completely radically different story. They don't point outward at all. They point directly at the relationship itself. The children cite unhealed trauma, a complete and utter lack of boundaries, feeling constantly criticized or judged, and above all, feeling profoundly unheard.
The contrast is jarring.
It is. The child says, "You didn't respect my autonomy." The parent says, "Your husband turned you against me." It is as if they were participating in two entirely different relationships for decades.
To understand how two people can experience the exact same history so differently, we have to dissect the anatomy of conflict itself. Why do these conversations fail so spectacularly?
Right.
Well, there is a brilliant framework developed by the Harvard Negotiation Project, detailed in the book Difficult Conversations by Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen. They propose that every single difficult conversation, whether it's a political debate or a mother and daughter fighting over boundaries, is actually three distinct, deeper conversations happening simultaneously.
Let's walk through these because this framework is honestly a skeleton key for unlocking family conflict. What is the first conversation?
The first layer is the what happened conversation. This is the surface level battleground. This is where we argue over who was right, who said what, and who is to blame for the current mess.
The facts.
Right, the supposed facts. The fatal flaw we all make in this layer is the assumption of intent. We make the catastrophic mistake of moving directly from impact to intent.
I do this all the time. If my partner snaps me, the impact is that my feelings are hurt. Therefore, I assume his intent was to hurt my feelings. Like, I feel wounded, so you must have wanted to wound me.
Exactly. And the human brain is literally wired to do this. We judge ourselves by our intentions, which we know are usually benign or self-protective, but we judge others solely by their impact on us.
That is so unfair, but so true.
Right. So, return to the estranged mother and child. Just because a mother's anxious, boundary-crossing actions hurt her child deeply does not mean the mother woke up with the malicious intention of causing pain. She probably intended to be loving or protective, but the child feels the suffocating impact and assumes malicious, controlling intent.
And the mother reacts to that accusation.
The mother knows she didn't intend harm, so she feels unjustly, cruelly accused. She becomes deeply defensive, and the conversation stalls right on the launchpad.
Which drags us right into the second layer, the feelings conversation. I noticed in my own life, and the sources point this out perfectly, we are remarkably bad at actually expressing our raw feelings during a conflict. We translate them.
Oh, constantly.
Instead of saying to a parent, when you criticized my parenting in front of my kids, I felt incredibly small, embarrassed, and undermined, we translate that raw, vulnerable feeling into a character judgment. We lash out and say, you are an incredibly selfish, toxic person.
And the psychological reality is that the moment you utter a character judgment, the other person's auditory processing essentially shuts down. They stop listening to your pain and start preparing their legal defense.
They're just building their counter argument.
Exactly. The raw emotion, which is the actual truth of the matter, is completely lost in the tactical attack. When feelings are left unexpressed and unnegotiated, they don't disappear. They just leak into the conversation as sarcasm, passive aggression, or rage, completely derailing any chance of resolution.
But even if you manage to navigate the facts, and even if you manage to express your feelings without attacking, there is still a massive roadblock. And I think this is the most powerful part of the framework. What is the third layer?
The third layer is the identity conversation. This is the silent, internal, often panicked monologue we're having with ourselves while the conflict is raging. Difficult conversations don't just threaten our peace, they threaten our core sense of self. We fall into catastrophic, all-or-nothing thinking.
So when I am arguing with my mother, I'm not just mad at her. Internally, I am terrified of what this fight means about me.
Precisely. The estranged mother is thinking, if I accept that I hurt my child enough for them to leave me, does that mean I am a fundamentally, irredeemably bad mother? Is my entire life's work a failure?
That's a terrifying thought.
It is. And the estranged child is thinking, if I cut off my parents, does that mean I am the ungrateful, unlovable, broken child they always implied I was? When our core identity is threatened like that, our nervous system panics. We literally cannot listen to the other person because all of our cognitive resources are diverted to fighting for our own psychological survival.
We can't admit fault because admitting fault feels like psychic death. This raises an incredibly daunting question, though. If we are trapped in these three layers, arguing relentlessly over facts and intents, hiding our vulnerable feelings behind vicious character attacks, and internally panicking that we are fundamentally bad people, how do we ever move past blame? How could a parent and an estranged child even begin to bridge a canyon that wide?
The Harvard framework introduces a crucial paradigm-shifting reframe here. It requires us to abandon the concept of blame entirely and replace it with contribution mapping.
Contribution mapping? How does that differ from blame? Honestly, it sounds like corporate speak for the exact same thing.
It is fundamentally different. Blame is about moral judgment. It asks, who is the bad guy here? Whose fault is this, and how should they be punished? Blame is inherently backward-looking, defensive, and provokes that identity panic we just discussed.
Right, nobody wants to be the bad guy.
Contribution, on the other hand, is an objective, mechanical look at how a dynamic was manufactured over time. It asks, what did each of us do or fail to do that got us into this exact mess?
Let's build out an analogy for this because it's a tricky distinction. Let's say I leave my car parked on the street. I roll down the windows, I leave the keys in the ignition, and I leave my wallet on the dashboard. And the car gets stolen. Am I to blame for the theft?
No. Morally and legally, the thief is 100% to blame. You are the victim of a crime.
But did my actions contribute to the situation? Yes. Acknowledging my contribution, like leaving the keys in the ignition, does not mean I am victim blaming myself. It doesn't absolve the thief. It simply means I am looking objectively at the mechanics of the event so I can understand how it happened and prevent it in the future.
That is the perfect distinction. Now, apply that to a highly charged family dynamic. A parent might step back and say, I am not morally to blame for my adult child's severe anxiety disorder, but my constant hovering criticism during their childhood contributed to an environment where they didn't feel psychologically safe to fail.
And the child has to do it too. The adult child might say, I am not to blame for my mother's complete lack of boundaries, but my historical refusal to ever speak up, my habit of just smiling and enduring it to keep the peace, well, that contributed to her genuine belief that her intrusive behavior was totally acceptable to me.
Exactly. Shifting from blame to contribution completely bypasses the identity panic. It removes the need for a bad guy. It allows both parties to sit on the same side of the table and say, look at this tangled mess between us. We co-created this dynamic over decades. Now, what specific actions do we need to take to uncreate it?
But wait, let me push back on this because it sounds incredibly rational and lovely in theory.
But in practice,
Right. What if the other person absolutely refuses to play ball? What if you go to your parent or your estranged child and you say, I've done the work, I recognize my contribution, let's map this out, and they just fold their arms, glare at you and say, no, This is 100% your fault. You're just using therapy speak to dodge responsibility. What do you do when the other person insists on playing the blame game?
It is the most common roadblock in reconciliation. But the framework offers unilateral techniques, strategies you can deploy, even if the other person is entirely uncooperative.
Okay, lay them on me.
The first is that you actively reframe their blame into contribution in real time. You refuse to catch the ball of blame they're throwing at you. If they say, this entire estrangement is your fault because you are selfish, you do not defend yourself.
You don't argue back?
No.
Oh.
You calmly respond, I agree that I played a major part in this. My actions absolutely contributed to where we are today. Let's look at how we both got here. You validate their anger, but you reframe the mechanics.
You absorb the energy of the attack and redirect it. What else?
The second technique is incredibly powerful. It's called naming the dynamic. If the conversation is spinning out of control, like if they keep interrupting you or denying your memories or name-calling you, stop arguing the topic entirely.
You zoom out.
You zoom out and you name the behavior that is happening in the room at that exact moment. You say, I'm trying to share how I feel about the past, but I notice that every time I start a sentence, you interrupt to tell me my feelings are incorrect. We cannot make any progress on our relationship if that dynamic keeps happening right now. You make the dysfunctional behavior itself the new topic of conversation.
That is incredibly empowering. It takes you off the defensive back foot and puts you in the observer's seat.
It breaks the cycle instantly.
But, as we talk about these intense, high-stakes conversations, I keep thinking about a physical behavior that I am totally guilty of, and I think almost everyone is. When we really desperately want someone to listen to us, especially a child or a partner who we feel is pulling away, we overtalk.
We do. We fill the space.
We fill the air. We raise our voice. We repeat their name like a mantra. We lecture like, Emma, Emma, are you listening to me? I asked you a question. Look at me, M.A.
It is the most natural human impulse in the world. When we feel unheard, we equate volume and repetition with clarity and importance. We operate under the delusion that if we just hurl enough words at the other person, the message will eventually penetrate their skull.
But the neuroscience tells us the exact opposite is true, doesn't it? Our words aren't penetrating at all.
They are not. We have to look at the neuroscience of tuning out. The human brain, specifically the auditory processing center, has a finite capacity for information. When a parent or a partner barrages someone with constant, elevated verbal input, the listener's nervous system just gets overwhelmed.
And what does a healthy brain do when it is overwhelmed by sensory input?
It filters, protects itself. This is often referred to as the cocktail party effect. If you're standing in a crowded, booming room, your brain is miraculous. It can tune out the chaotic background noise to focus intensely on the one conversation you are having. Well, if you overtalk, if you repeat a child's name endlessly in a lecturing tone, their brain recognizes the pattern. It literally recategorizes your voice. You are no longer transmitting urgent, novel information. You are categorized as predictable, safe background noise. The irony is staggering. The more frantically you talk, the less they physically hear you.
So if words are failing, if they're actually making the problem worse, what is the antidote? What tool do we use?
We use the spaces between the words. We use silence. In Japanese aesthetics, there is a profound concept called M-A. It translates to the purposeful use of negative space or emptiness.
Think of it like a tense scene in a brilliant film, right? The characters are arguing, the music is swelling, the dialogue is rapid fire, and then suddenly everything stops. There's just silence. No music, no talking. That pause isn't just empty air. It is the most agonizing, heavy, meaningful part of the scene.
The silence holds all the tension.
Exactly. If the characters kept yelling, it would just be noise. The ma gives the scene its power.
That is a brilliant analogy. And ma applies directly to interpersonal communication. In the West, we sometimes clumsily call it the pregnant pause. It is a deliberate, intentional silence loaded with meaning. When we constantly talk, we are cramming the room with noise. When we use ma, we give our communication incredible gravity. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is a different, often far more potent form of presence.
I love how the clinical work of Julie Weigel, a family therapist in our sources, translates this philosophy into practical application. She talks about combining this silence with something called proxemics, which is the psychological use of physical space. So let's go back to the living room. Instead of yelling across the house to a teenager who is ignoring you and staring at a screen, what do?
You utilize proxemics and ma. You do not yell. You do not repeat their name from the kitchen. You walk into the room. You move into their physical space, you make gentle, non-threatening eye contact, you deliver a very brief, exceptionally clear message. It is time to turn off the game. And then
Yeah.
you wait.
You just stand there in total silence.
Yes, you hold the ma. It is a form of what clinicians call gentle attunement. You are matching their rhythm, but holding your boundary. From a behavioral standpoint, this acts as negative reinforcement. Not a punishment, but a psychological pressure. Your calm, patient, silent, physical presence creates a slight, uncomfortable pressure in the room. The child wants you to leave so they can go back to their game, but you will not leave until the request is met.
And the pressure is only relieved when they comply.
Right. But far more importantly, think about what that silence communicates on a deeper level. When you give an instruction and then wait calmly, your silence is speaking volumes. It says, I believe you heard me the first time. I am completely confident in my authority, so I don't need to yell. I respect your need for a few seconds to transition your brain away from the screen, and I trust that you will follow through.
Contrast that with yelling from the kitchen 4 times.
Yeah.
Yelling communicates the exact opposite. It says, I know you aren't listening to me. I have absolutely no actual control in this house. I am emotionally dysregulated, frantic, and desperate.
We teach by example.
If we want our kids or our partners to be calm and attentive, we have to model a calm, attentive presence.
I will say, it requires tremendous internal self-regulation. It is physically and emotionally much harder to stand in silence than it is to indulge the impulse to yell. Your heart might be racing, but the long-term benefits are profound. It builds mutual respect, and it builds the child's self-efficacy.
Let's bring this all full circle. We started this deep dive in the childhood home, talking about those invisible, toxic, unspoken family rules, the don't have needs, the always pretend everything is fine. How do we take this powerful, intentional silence, this ma, and combine it with the monumental task of rewriting those deeply embedded scripts?
Dr. Jonas Webb offers a very clear 4-step process to override those toxic rules, and it pairs perfectly with the concept of intentional silence.
Walk me through the steps.
Step 1 is identification. You must become aware of the invisible rules in your head. You have to drag them out of the unconscious, write them down. My rule is that my emotions are a burden to others.
Put it on paper.
Yes. Step 2 is observation. Pay attention to when these rules speak to you in daily life. This is where the silence is crucial. When you're in a conflict and you feel the overwhelming urge to overtalk, or conversely, the urge to shrink and hide your feelings, you must pause. You use the ma internally. You create a moment of silence in your own mind to catch the script running in real time.
You have to hear the frequency before you can change the channel.
Precisely. Step 3 is action. Create an opposing, healthy rule. You literally rewrite the script. You consciously change the internal monologue from don't talk about anything meaningful that causes conflict to I will talk about my feelings safely and clearly because my feelings matter.
I love that. And the last step.
Finally, step 4 is education. Learn the emotional skills you missed in childhood. If you were raised in a high-conformity home and taught to ignore your feelings, you have to actively practice identifying them. It is never too late to learn how to name an emotion, process it, and communicate it instead of just burying it under a forced smile.
Which means, ultimately, we are not doomed by our inheritance.
Not at all. We are undeniably shaped by it. It provides the rough draft.
Yeah.
But we hold the pen for the revisions.
I want to take a moment to speak directly to you, the person listening right now. If you struggle with these conversations, if you catch yourself repeating those toxic family rules, feeling like a scared, silenced 10-year-old in your childhood home, or if you feel a profound, aching disconnect with your parents or a terrifying distance from your own children, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not broken.
You're human.
You are not uniquely flawed, and you are not a failure. You are simply a human being operating on an outdated script that you were handed long before you even knew how to read. The friction you feel in your relationships right now, that isn't a sign that you were doing it wrong. That friction is just the sound of you outgrowing that script. It is the sound of you trying to write a new one.
If we look back at the immense ground we've covered today, it is a journey from the invisible to the intentional. We started with the silent, suffocating weight of childhood emotional neglect, the unspoken rules that demand we shrink ourselves to keep the peace. We saw how those fragile rules, when subjected to the massive systemic shocks of cultural uprooting and the literal erosion of shared language, can leave families stranded on opposite sides of an unbridgeable canyon.
It's a lot to carry.
It is. We examine the painful, modern reality of estrangement and the courageous psychological shift required to move away from defensive blame and toward objective contribution mapping. And finally, we found a tool for real connection, not in the frantic accumulation of more words, but in the profound, respectful stillness of intentional silence.
We spend so much of our lives trying to find the exact right words to fix our relationships. We rehearse speeches in the shower. We draft long, emotional text messages in our notes app and then delete them. We think that if we just find the perfect combination of vocabulary, the other person will finally understand us. But maybe the real healing doesn't happen in the words at all. Maybe the most profound shifts in your family, the moments that actually change the trajectory of your relationships, will happen in the ma. In the intentional, respectful, patient silence you create between the words. The script of your family's future is waiting to be written, and you hold the pen.
If this conversation felt true for you, if something in here landed, we would love for you to subscribe to Leone Patterns so you never miss what we explore next.
Leave a comment and tell us, what did this bring up for you? We read every single one. We are building a community here, people who think about human behavior differently, not as something broken to fix, but as a human experience to understand.
You are not alone in this,
Yeah.
and we are genuinely glad you were here at Leone Patterns.
Same pace,
Right.
same questions. See you then.